Well, as you probably know, most people have parents. They may or may not know them, but they have parents. So I had a father, and my father was a motion picture director. And he made a movie in 1924, and I was 3 years old, and I appeared in it. The first movies that my father made was with my mother as the star of the movies. Her stage name was Catherine Hessling, and she was not a professional actress, really. She had not been trained, but suddenly she was the star. And that's perfectly all right in a home movie, but it does not really work for professional movies. And that, I think, created a tension which ended in their separation. As far as my grandfather, who was a painter, when I was a little child, he was just not mentioned. There were paintings around, all around me, but I just assumed that, everybody had a grandfather who had to splash colors on bits of canvas. I remember once we were in the living room in Paris, and there was on the wall a rather well-known painting of my father's called The Hunter, which was made by my grandfather when my father was 14 years of age. And it's rather paradoxical because my father never killed an animal in his life. But, well, there he is as a hunter. And my father had a very good friend and collaborator by the name of Karl Koch. And he suddenly got up, went to the painting, pointed his finger at one little white spot on the lock of the gun and said, "Look at that white spot, look at what it does," and began discussing what it did for the whole painting. And somehow that started a discussion on my grandfather, and then I became quite aware of who was my grandfather, I had a cousin by the name of Claude Renoir, who was a very well-known cameraman, and he had gone to Africa to make a movie. And about a month after he was back, or maybe 2 months, I went to see him in his apartment. And he had brought from Africa 2 ostrich eggs. And he had kept those things. But of course they had rotten. And the stench was really quite objectionable, very objectionable indeed. But the sight and smell of those 2 ostrich eggs made me dream. It would be so wonderful to go to places where you can collect ostrich eggs and you bring them back home and they stink. And from that moment on, I wanted to be a cameraman. But there were other reasons. In school, I was a lousy student, you see. And I never graduated from high school because I absolutely refused to do anything. And so when I was kicked out for good, my father decided that I should learn something else. So he sent me to work in a factory. And every day at 7:30 in the morning, I had to punch a clock. And that was a very, very good lesson. And from that, after about, I've forgotten, 4 or 5 months of that, then he allowed me to be an apprentice cameraman. It was in my father's movie, The Human Beast. And I was all excited, and it was wonderful, but it did teach me things. It taught me to be quiet, which is difficult for me. It taught me to do things on time. My father was a great believer in doing one's job. That is to say, he believed very much that if you decide to do something, you must try to do it well. And I remember one case, for instance, we had been shooting at night, and we had the 2 actors, Jean Gabin and Simon, and to simulate rain, we had the firemen. And everybody was drenched, absolutely drenched. And we had been shooting that scene over and over and over and over again. And my cousin, Claude, who was the cameraman, had been behind that camera. And while my father was talking to the actors, and obviously we were not going to start shooting again for a while, Claude let the camera go down, and he abandoned the camera, and turned around to go get a cup of coffee. And somehow, and I still remember that very clearly, somehow my father must have sensed it. He turned around and said, "Claude, if you want to work 8 hours a day, you can get a job as a plumber or a carpenter, and that would be quite all right. It's very reputable. But if you want to be a cameraman, you are going to stay behind that camera no matter what you are until the scene is finished. and all of us, because we were all going to go and have a cup of coffee, and all of us knew damn well that he was actually directing his remarks to all of us, so no one had any coffee. And finally he got the scene, and it's one of the very best scenes in the movie. Since we are supposed to talk about the rules of the game, I was second assistant cameraman there. Occasionally we would all trade roles, and you had to. And I remember one shot which I took was the shot in which the car has an accident. I was the operator in that one. The rules of the game, in many ways, for me, was a fun movie because it was sort of a family affair. Practically everyone was related, in there. The editor was my father's girlfriend, and her name was Marguerite Houillet. And she had added the name Renoir after that. She's usually listed as Marguerite Houillet Renoir. Now, Dido, who became my stepmother, was the script girl. And that created an awkward situation because it was very obvious that my father was becoming interested in her, and therefore Marguerite was not terribly happy. Well, Dido was, number one, I must say that she was wonderful to me. I mean, she was absolutely wonderful. I felt much closer to her, I must say, than I felt to my mother. You see. And she was really indispensable to my father. Among other things, she was very specific. She could keep books, she remembered dates and things, which my father could never have done. I mean, he owed her just an immense amount because she understood what he was doing, and she sort of, I'm trying to avoid the horrible word, to be supportive, which I absolutely detest. And but she really helped in a completely unselfish and quite bright way. One of my father's collaborators was, of course, Cartier-Bresson, and the man was incredibly gifted. Even then, he of course became a famous cameraman since that. But even then, he had a knack for seeing the thing that should be recorded and the angle from which it would be recorded. And I must say that I was much younger than he was, but he very often took me around and showed me things and showed me how one should take a picture, and whatnot, and so that I have very fond memories of him. The reason why the actress Nora Gregor got the part was her husband was the Prince Sternberg, and the Nazis at the Anschluss were going to get him, and he had to leave Austria with his wife. And my father, who hated the Nazis, met them accidentally, and he just had to have Nora Gregor in a movie just because of that. The rules of the game were shot at a time of political uncertainty. Everybody knew there was going to be a war eventually. That was very obvious. So there was a feeling of insecurity about the future, but I think that while we were shooting, we forgot about it. We all were concerned with making a movie. Where the most important thing in the world then was making that movie. I remember quite well the shooting in the studio, and I remember it was lots of fun, and I remember my father dressed as a bear and actually sweating inside that bear skin of his. There is always, of course, a crossover between personal and professional lives. In the case of my father, so many of the things he did as a movie maker, as a theater writer and director, and then as a writer, are really just like him in his private life. It's sort of amazing, The way he plays Octave in the rules of the game, he's just playing himself. That's the way he was, the way he talked, the way he gesticulated. He did not have to create a character. He spoke the way he did. And in his movies, he presented, well, his movies really represent the way he saw life. One thing which seems paradoxical today, but I don't think it is that my father was at the same time very unconventional and extremely traditional. And I think the two things go together. At a time when we have rejected tradition, someone who is traditional is by definition unconventional. And that was very much his case. I still remember when the first time he visited me when I was in graduate school, he asked me whether in my program for my eventual examination, my program included Goethe, And I said no. And he was sort of shocked that one could get a PhD in literature without studying Goethe. That, to him, that was just, so to speak, a non-concept. We always wonder what influences people. And I would say that my father had only two seminal influences. One was, of course, his schooling as a child, but there was another influence, the military. When the First World War broke out, my father was a career non-commissioned officer, sergeant, in the French cavalry, in the dragoons. And some of the effect that the cavalry had upon him can be seen in his film. For instance, he repeated to me over and over again that in the cavalry there was no such thing as a white horse or a black horse. It did not exist. In the cavalry, a white horse was a light gray horse, and a black horse was a dark gray horse. Because in order to be white, you would have to have only white hair. And surely on that horse there was a little black hair somewhere. In order to be black, you must be all black. And of course there was a little white hair somewhere. Well, if you think for a second, you can see that that applies to everything he did. You have nothing that is just straightforward and cut dry. People are always a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And that's a lesson which he preached all his life. My father had a knack for getting people to do exactly what he wanted, pretending for them and for himself that it was not the case. For instance, he would say to the actor, "Oh, this is wonderful. This is absolutely wonderful. But it might be fun to try something else." Never saying it was lousy. And eventually, I knew damn well where he was going. And eventually, it would be the same thing with the camera. And he would say, this shot is wonderful. It might be interesting to try it from just a slightly different way. And eventually, it was what he wanted, but he never told them, or very seldom anyway, that is what I want done. I will tell you an anecdote, but for obvious reasons, I will not give the name. On one particular occasion, a certain actor, I'd heard a certain actor spouting about his part in the movie, and it was obviously totally wrong. Well, that night, I went back home, and my father and I met at the door of the apartment. And I said, "Oh, Dad, this guy, I'll call him X, said that and that. He completely misunderstood the movie. I think you should tell him." And my father turned on me and said, "Don't you say a word to him. When an actor understands his part in a play or a movie, he can no longer play it." He would insist when he would try out a new actor on having that person read from a book and read with absolutely no expression. And I've seen him do that over and over again. Ask him to reread and read about it, and I say, "You have too much expression there." To just read it absolutely with an even voice and no expression whatsoever. You must not impose your interpretation upon the book. It must be the book that imposes itself on you. If you look at the vase behind me there, which is by my father, you can see that when he was young, he quit making ceramics in 1924. But if you look at his ceramics, you could see that he was much more influenced by Cézanne than by my grandfather. And he said himself that when he was young, he tried to avoid the influence of his own father. On the other hand, when he grew much older, then it went the other way around. If you ever look at a movie of his entitled A Picnic on the Grass, you will see that it is straight out of my grandfather. For instance, most of it was shot at my grandfather's house, the house where I was born, in fact, and it is a movie that is very much against science. And my grandfather hated science. And my father had liked science when he was young, but at the end, he absolutely hated science. My father, as it turns out, sort of lived in the 18th century in many ways. And in his case, the rules of the game was primarily an 18th century comedy. And he has said several times that he was very surprised when the reception was so bad and people were so indignant because of the political and social implications. But of course, I'm sure that he must have known, maybe not consciously, that all 18th century comedies, or most of them, were social criticism. He certainly could not have missed that. The film was extremely badly received, and my father did not expect that. And he was really, I've seldom seen him depressed. He was not a depressed type, but then he was really depressed. And in fact, he thought for a while of giving up making movies. And of course, he should have expected it, because the movie was shown at a theater in the most elegant and expensive part of Paris. And the public that went there was bound to dislike it. They were bound to consider the movie not as mere social criticism, but as a caricature of themselves. There is a rather famous scene in it, which is a hunting scene. And my father could never, as I said, have killed an animal. And seeing an animal killed would really make him extremely unhappy. But he thought he ought to have that, because he wanted to point out that people, especially people of a certain class, though it applies to all classes, enjoy killing for nothing.
Ricky, tu aimes la chasse?
Oh oui, madame. Et vous?
The rules of the games obviously had a strange career, since it was a flop, a terrible flop at the beginning, and since that it's become sort of a classic. Why? Well, I think that as a result of progress, particularly mass communication and automation, people are unwittingly bored with their own lives. In fact, my father himself once remarked that we had made a trade, and it's a very bad trade. The trade was this. With the 20th century, we acquired something we did not have before. It was comfort. But we had to trade something, and what we traded was joy. And we have much less joy than we had before. I think that the rules of the game tend to show us that not so long ago you already had sort of artificial joy, but it was already disintegrating. And I think that unwittingly this sort of strikes a chord in people's hearts, you see.